thank you so much for jumping on this such short notice. It's greatly appreciated. We found that it's had quite a lot of interest on TikTok specifically, which is a really big platform for us. So again, to get a professional perspective on this is really valuable and appreciated. And I suppose, I mean, there's various aspects that are kind of coming up for us as a company covering the story. There's various lines that have came out. We've had a mystery woman who ran off during the incident. And we were also discussing how potentially this guy may or may not have had his face covered. How would that implicate how easy or how hard it is for this guy to be found? And something that we briefly touched on just there was, potentially, is this for money or was it political? And sort of touching on there's like three chilling words that we've seen sort of come up on his on the bullet casing supposedly. So I think there's a lot of different things to do with this, and I thought it would be great to just hear your initial take on it, and kind of what you're thinking.
Well, I mean, my initial appreciation, obviously, with some limited information, and you've got to understand that, obviously, at this instance, there's a lot of information that's going to be coming in from various different eyewitnesses, from individuals like me who'll be speculating on what happened and what we've seen. But based on my 30 years of experience of protecting people against these types of threats, and particularly where there is a threat to harm on a very fatal level, I would say this comes at the very lower end or the shallow end of the assassination pool, if you like. And that is based on a number of different factors. There are some forensic evidence that's been left by the shooter, supposedly in an alleyway where he was staging himself. And when we say staging, he was standing in an alleyway looking or waiting from an observation position for his target to leave the building in question. But he supposedly, and the police are linking it, there's a water bottle, there's a candy wrapper, and there's a phone that was left there. Now, any serious professional assassin is not going to be leaving any kind of evidence, certainly on that level. The second thing is, from the video that I watched of the assassination itself, again, the distance of which the assassin and the target would say to me that this was someone that was not highly experienced, albeit they were using a suppressed weapon, which is perfectly understandable in a busy metropolis. You don't want to draw any more attention than is necessary. But when you do use a suppressed weapon, the cycle of the bullets into the chamber will always be somewhat stopped or will be blocked. So you will not have a clean cycle, as we would call it. But he shows, obviously, experience with a firearm because he clears the stoppage very quickly. But the shots themselves were done at distance. If it is a highly professional assassin, they will come up very close to ensure that they do not have to discharge more than a single bullet, if you want.
Mm-hmm.
And that would probably involve them coming up directly behind them, placing the weapon at the base of their skull, discharging the weapon, and that would have been it.
Wow. Well, no, it's fascinating to hear because obviously the fact that he waited for his target, you may wonder how much experience he had. So from your sort of perspective, you would think that he's got a degree of experience, but it's probably not quite to the top level.
No, I mean, when we look at more sophisticated assassinations, there are generally rules applied by the professionals, and they will be based on three fundamentals of attack that'll either involve water, fire, or gravity. And we know gravity has certainly been used by GRU, Russian agents, against some of the enemies of Putin in various countries across the world, where people have taken a skydive off the top of a building. Now, again, there is this distance between also covert and clandestine. Covert, we would generally apply the term in the instances where you have an individual that you want it to be known that this was a statement killing. Now, in this instance, with the three words actually imprinted on the bullet casings, and from what we can see, it was a 9mm attack rather on a parabellum, rather than, say, a .22, which is usually more conventional in assassinations. But these bullets being inscribed with those three words says to me that they wanted to leave a statement. Clandestine, on the other hand, will be something which has been done and nobody can attribute to any one particular party. So I think determining the motivation, determining the person behind it, and even
Hmm.
identifying that the assassin themselves may not be as much of a challenge as we might think.
Hmm. No, that's fascinating. And based on what we know at the minute, we've seen that there was various messages left at the scene that may suggest some sort of political motivation potentially, or a personal motivation, but also potentially a monetary motivation as well. What would your inclination be in relation to why this has happened?
Well, I mean, I would say that, and this is again based purely on speculation at this point, that it would seem to be someone who does have some sort of protest against Brian Thompson himself. It was something that was very directed to him, or as the, if you like, the representative for this huge healthcare company. Now, from my professional perspective, looking at the potential target, and that's the first thing I will always do with a principal, is I'll look at who they are, what they do, who they're associated to. Is their message potentially political? Is it potentially agitating? What groups or individuals would have the desire or the motivation to cause or create harm? And this is quite often the case that we have to do these assessments when the threat may be anonymous. Now, we're understanding from his widow that in the preceding days, if not weeks, if not possibly months, we don't know yet, she was aware that there were threats against her husband. Now, who these threats were, where they came from, I don't know. But one question mark in my head is the head of security for the healthcare company, and why, if there were threats, there wasn't any close protection or any kind of security that was adopted to Mr. Thompson, particularly as he was coming in for a very significant meeting in Manhattan, which was an investors relations meeting.
Yeah, no, definitely, and that it was part of what I was going to ask as well. Is there some, is there more that could have been done in relation to that? And like, sorry, I've just kind of lost my train of thought there, but yeah, I suppose like when you know that something like that is potentially going to happen, specifically in relation to what the wife has said, is there, was there more that could have been done? Do you think that he could have prevented it himself potentially, or is there people that needed to maybe be around him at the time, or what sort of steps could have been done at a broader scale and at a closer scale, like within that moment? Is there more that man could have done to protect himself potentially?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that could have been done. I mean, over and beyond assigning close protection to him to ensure that obviously he could go about his business if there were prevailing threats. Well, one of the things that I've done with many people in the public eye, that's including celebrities, former heads of state, but also individuals that are at threat, is to look at what we call the pattern of life. Now, the pattern of life is our day-to-day routines, and we can fall into these routines very easily, which then make us very predictable if we're subject to any kind of hostile surveillance. And in this instance with Mr. Thompson, the assassin evidently knew that Mr. Thompson was going to be leaving the property at around about that time. And secondly, in terms of him leaving on his own. Now, if there were other people there, that would have complicated the plot. Now, the first thing I would say is do not become predictable. If you become predictable, then your aggressors or your assassin can plan accordingly to determine when and where they can carry out that attack. So the first thing I always say to principals who are at possible risk, if not actual evidential risk, will be make yourself unpredictable. If you are unpredictable, leave by a separate entrance from the hotel. Leave at a different time from the hotel. Leave with other people around you at the same time. Don't leave on your own. And at 6:45 in the morning, he was likely to be on his own. There would have been very little foot traffic around. So ideal circumstances potentially for an assassin to target him.
Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah, no, it is interesting to think that based off of the threats that he had received, that there was maybe like sort of not a reluctance to protect himself, but just maybe a thought that it maybe just wouldn't happen to him potentially. As you said, it's purely speculative. But I suppose at the minute, then, based off of the current situation, it seems as though he is still at large. What sort of steps would the police be doing to find him, and also how does someone escape in a way that would you could argue is easy in such a big city. Does the city aspect make it easier, or does it make it more difficult? How does that all come into play?
Well, it works. It works on two levels. I mean, in terms of identifying and tracing him, as we mentioned, those forensic treasures which he left, it could potentially be utilized by the authorities, but evidently only if this individual's already been known to the authorities. If he's not known, then it's going to make it a heck of a lot harder. In terms of his extraction plan, it was pretty good. In a city, yes, there is loads and loads of CCTV, but that's probably why he concealed his face and he wore fairly anonymous and unidentifiable clothing, no insignia on there, for example, as far as I could see. Leaving on a city bike, which is equivalent to us in the UK, the Lime bike or the Boris bike, if you like, was a very good drill that allows you to obviously traverse various areas which you wouldn't necessarily be able to do so on a motorcycle or in a car. And he entered into Central Park. And having worked in Manhattan extensively, I know that once you're into Central Park, you can become entirely lost. You've got four options, the four sides of the square, if you like, of Central Park that you can exit by, multiple access egress points. So again, likely if I was the assassin, I would have had the clothes, which were outer clothes. He did have a backpack on. Very likely that could conceal both not only a hat, but those outer clothes. So you could change your appearance before you exit the park. And there were plenty of places in Central Park where I could hide myself, conceal myself whilst I'm undertaking that change.
And what sort of protections will be getting made to protect the family now of the victim? Is there steps that the authorities might be making to ensure that that nothing else happens?
Well, I think his widow will certainly be interviewed extensively now by the authorities to try and find out and ascertain who might have been behind this. If I was the head of security for the company, I would be assigning security to her, close protection, and to the children if need be. And that is, to a certain extent, more as a reassurance than necessarily reciprocal attacks or further attacks that might be undertaken. She will be in a very, very distressed position, obviously, right now, as will the children. So that layer of close protection is really more symbolic about reassuring her that she and the children are safe until further information can come to light. But the danger always, and I know this from personal experience, is that unless you keep that close protection in there only for a defined period, if it seemed to be limitless, it creates a false sense of security and a security blanket, which unless she's going to have it for the rest of her life, if you remove it, and particularly if the authorities haven't determined who the attacker was and who was behind it, could make her feel even more exposed when it is removed. So you have to consider how you introduce that, why you introduce it, and for how long you introduce it for.
Fascinating. No, that's really, really interesting. And yeah, it's something that I didn't even consider to think about, and that is really, really interesting. And just as well, just sort of coming back to the original point of discussion about how the shooter was waiting for the victim. What like how does someone such as the assassin get that information? What is how does that come about? Because I can imagine there's probably various ways potentially.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly that advanced reconnaissance for any assassin or kidnapper, for that matter, is the most critical part of making the plan of how that attack or that capture is going to take place. So there is no doubt that either working alone or in party with other individuals, they would have been undertaking surveillance on Mr. Thompson prior to the attack actually taking place. And that would be to determine, as I mentioned earlier, that pattern of life. What time was he regularly leaving in the morning? Now, I would not be surprised if him leaving the hotel at that time of day was something that he had repeated the day before and possibly even the day before that. I don't know when he actually came into Manhattan, but there's every good chance that he may have identified a coffee shop. And quite often you will see people first thing in the morning, they may wander to a local coffee shop to get breakfast or get a coffee, then return to their hotel. Now, people, again, are creatures of habit, they're creatures of routine, which plays into the hands of someone who presents a threat. And that's why when you are in that sphere or that environment of a threat, you've got to be so careful. You've got to change that routine.
No, it's fascinating. Really, really interesting. Do you think there's any potential that his whereabouts may have been tipped off to the person that perpetrated the assassination.
That can't be discounted. That can't be
Hmm.
discounted. And again, any company should be very wary of any social engineering. And when I say social engineering, that is calling under a false pretense or under a false identity, maybe as an associate, the assistant for one of the associates, or someone who has a vested interest to find out what their movements would be. And it could be with a premise of I need to get something to Mr. Thompson. Which hotel is he at? I've got important documents to deliver. It could be all sorts of various things. I mean, those are just ones I can think of off the top of my head. With
Mm-hmm.
consideration, there are lots of ways that you could potentially speak to an assistant, speak to someone in the office that might have that information of his whereabouts, might know what his schedule is, and again, giving some pretense of a bona fide reason for getting in touch to know how he's staying, where he's staying, who he's staying with, and looking at obviously the proximity of, for example, the hotel to the venue where they were going to have this investors meeting and how he
Mm-hmm.
might move from one to the other. It could be I'm calling up from the town car company to find out what time we're
Mm.
picking him up so that we can plan the travel through busy midtown Manhattan traffic, which any of us who've been there knows can be horrific.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. Thank you so much. And the last question I wanted to ask, just I know that we've briefly touched on it as well in terms of the message that was left. Why would someone leave a message at a scene like that? Is that in relation to an experience or to make a point? You know, why would you do that?
Exactly that, Matt. It's to make a point, it's to make a statement. Now, again, that statement may be actually directly associated to the assassination, or it could be a red herring. You cannot necessarily take
Mm,
these things as verbatim. The statement in itself was the assassination and the assassination in public. That's a statement in itself. The
hmm.
words inscribed on the bullet casings, that may or may not be connected. Again, only time will tell.
Hmm. Fascinating. Thank you so much. And well, I would love for you to just sort of maybe give a little bit about your experience and sort of what you do and how that sort of impacts like your understanding of situations like this. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about that.
Sure, no problems at all. I've been in the specialist security sector for over 30 years. I've operated across the world looking after former heads of state through to businessmen, CEOs, industrialists, celebrities, even members of foreign royal families. I've operated in Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, Mexico, North America, Southeast Asia, pretty much
Wow.
across the world. And I've dealt with kidnapping attempts, extortion, blackmail, and death threats. And I've even had
Wow.
a couple of threats against myself.
And I'm sure that you have so many more stories of your own that just go beyond like into aspects that we probably have no idea about. So yeah, thank you so much for all
My
of that
pleasure.
insight. It's absolutely invaluable. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.